Welcome to Josh's Worst Nightmare Oddcast presented by Denver Horror Collective. I'm your host, author Josh Schlossberg, surveying the dark landscape of biological horror fiction. For this episode, we're being charmed by Brian Asman. Brian is a writer, actor, director, and producer from San Diego, California. He's the author of the hit indie novella Man, Fuck This House, recently optioned by a major streaming service. His other books include I'm Not Even Supposed to Be Here Today, Neo Arcana, Nunchuck City, Jailbroke, and Return of the Living Elves. He's recently published short stories in pulp modern, kelp, Welcome to the Splatter Club, and Lost Films, and comics in Tales of Horrorgasm. Welcome to my nightmare, Brian.
Hey, Josh, it's great to be here. Thanks for having me on.
Absolutely. Well, on Josh's Worst Nightmare, I invite on horror authors to talk about an aspect of biological horror, which I define as living creatures and vital processes relevant to their writing. This episode, we're talking about elves. Elves, the plural of elf.
Yes.
So I'm excited about this. I mean, I'm excited about every topic, but I'm particularly excited about this because I have long been enamored of elves from back in Tolkien days. Brian Froud, who did these really cool books with all sorts of weird elf stuff, Celtic and British mythology, fairy tales, everything like that. So what was your introduction to the elf kingdom?
Ooh, well, I think like a lot of kids, the Christmas elves, Santa's elves, like the elves I'm talking about in the book. Although my mom read The Hobbit and The Lord of the Rings to me at a very early age, so the Tolkien fantasy elf was also swiftly became a part of my elfish lexicon. And then I think when I was, I got to be like 11, 12, 13, I started playing Warhammer. And I first played as the High Elves. And then, in the mid-90s, they started putting out Wood Elf miniatures. And so I switched to Wood Elves. And I remember like when I was like 16 or so, like I was like a Wood Elf army. And that was a lot of fun. But my brother would always kick my ass because he played as either undead or chaos and they had better magic.
Fair. So the difference between the high elf and the wood elf, explain that.
Yeah, so kind of like high elves are kind of like the city elves. They're fancy, they drive fancy cars, live in nice high rises, and the wood elves are kind of like the rednecks.
I like that redneck elf. Sure, yeah, I would. Yeah, I'm sure they could play the banjo pretty well. Yeah, I do like the Tolkien elves. Yeah, I guess those are more the high elves, the fantasy elves, as you call them. But yeah, the wood elves a little bit more, maybe like ratchet. Yeah, a little bit.
They're more rustic. Not really. I was just playing with that. They're more rustic. They're more in touch with nature and their roots, whereas the high elves are a little more technological.
Yeah, okay, that makes sense. And yeah, so of course the Christmas elf component. So I was raised as a Jew, and so we didn't really have Christmas elves. So I guess my introduction to elves, so that's of course probably most people's introduction to elves is the innocuous Christmas elf, pretty much.
Well, they're not really innocuous though, because the economics of the North Pole are very unclear, and that's one of the things I tried to get into in my book, Return of the Living Elves. No one ever talks about how are these elves getting paid? What are their living conditions like? Is anyone looking out for these elves? Are they employees? Are they volunteers? Are they slaves? We don't know.
Those are important questions. Yeah, I think are oft overlooked. We just like to think of them as they're benevolent volunteers for some reason. It's like, why would they do that? It's hard work. They're in the Arctic, which, I mean, as an elf, I don't know if they choose to live in the Arctic. So yeah, there's some stuff going on there.
Exactly. And although that extends to Santa Claus himself too. Not sure if you've ever read any Dennis Cooper, but I just read his novel I Wished, and he's talking about Santa Claus in one particular chapter, and it really struck me that he's like, Santa Claus is kind of no one ever wonders about Santa Claus's interior life. He's just like this vending machine that we collectively as society use to give ourselves shit. But like, no one wonders like what he cares about, what his hopes and dreams are. He's just there to serve us.
True. It's very selfish of us to think of that. But yeah,
Yeah.
he's considered by some, well, there's the line, right? Jolly old elf. So do you consider
Yes.
Santa an elf or just an elf oppressor?
I think that's a good question, right? Is he an elf or is he something else? It's certainly possible he's an elf who's oppressing other elves. Wouldn't be the first time that's happened.
Wow.
But
Interesting. So kind of a tribal kind of warfare thing there. Yeah, that's
very, could awesome. Be, could be. Well, yeah, so are we talking in general? Are we talking about the book now, by the way?
We can do, there's no rules. We are on the book right now. So let's talk a little bit more about the book and then we'll get a little bit more into generic elf aspects. So yeah, what else about the book and the elf component should we know?
Yeah, so I guess we might get into late spoiler territory here, but I'll try and keep it not plot centric, but related to the world itself. But in the world of Return of the Living Elves, there is a highly advanced and militaristic society at the North Pole. And this society has divided itself into first-class citizens and second-class citizens. And the first-class citizens are the Clauses, and the second-class citizens are called the Kringles. And essentially, the Clauses keep the Kringles down, and the Clauses are the bougie upper classes, and the Kringles do things like join the military and dig ditches, yada yada. But they're not elves. So elves, elves in my world are very much. They're even lower on the social strata than the Kringles. They're essentially just used as disposable drones and live in squalid conditions and have horrific lives.
Yeah. Well, it does seem as if all of the, well, maybe not all of it. I would say the high fantasy elves might be different, but a lot of the other tales of elves, it's kind of like they're at humans' disposal. They are kind of, I don't want to say a slave race, but kind of.
Yeah, they like get off on cobbling and things like that. It's
yeah. Well,
it's like, yeah, they're just here to serve us or something, or even like, I think it's like something that we tell ourselves to make it, because in all those, they like enjoy it, and so we're telling ourselves that they enjoy serving us so we can feel good about it.
Yeah, the kids love making our iPhones in the sweatshops. It's fun for them.
Yeah, it's a good old time.
So what made you want to write about elves besides just your past of Warhammer and whatnot?
Money.
Yeah, so, big money in the elf market. Yeah, huge.
Yeah, so I just had this idea to write a Christmas book. I thought it'd be fun to have like a seasonal horror book that really skewers a lot of pop culture tropes around Christmas. And so the title just kind of popped into my head, and I went from there. I'm a huge fan of Return of the Living Dead, and I just decided, hey, I can just kind of steal the plot for Return of the Living Dead and make it about elves and make it all Christmassy, and no one will notice, even if I put a poem in the front of my book saying that this is exactly what I did.
Nice. I love it. Well, so obviously the title is reminiscent of zombies. You don't have to answer the question. You can just ignore it. But should we potentially expect zombie elves?
These are literally elf zombies, yes.
Okay, so that's
that. Yeah, it's okay. I mean, there's a zombie elf on the cover. He's kind of like rotted away.
Like it. I mean, who knows what your version of it. So you would say they count as zombie elves then?
They're literally described as zombie elves in the book, yes.
Perfect. Beautiful. Yeah, I'm definitely going to have to read that. That sounds awesome. So yeah, let's talk a little bit more about elves in general. So when I was younger, I'm not saying I believed in elves, but I wanted to believe in elves. And I tried to summon the Gnome King and he didn't show up. And I was kind of like, well, fuck these guys, and yeah. I was still trying to be like, well, maybe they're possible because they're in all this folklore and fairy tales, and pretty much every culture has a version of just like a little thing, whether it's Celtic, of course, that's the one we're most familiar with, Celtic and British, but either
Right.
Native American, African, Asian, they all have like a little thing that does some weird stuff.
Right.
Yeah. So what do you feel like the significance of that? I mean, it has to mean that they're real, basically.
Right. The same way that, there are dragons in every culture. And, that must mean that dragons are real and not that, people just kept finding bones that look like them or something like that,
I mean, we don't know for a fact, but I mean, it would be a coincidence that all these cultures independently came up with a little thing. I mean, one of the theories is that I forget if it was the Picts or some group that lived in the Celtic hinterlands, and they were smaller stature. And
Mhm.
so they were just kind of, that's where that whole myth of the little people came about. So that's one potential explanation.
I think that's part of it, but I think humans are generally just imaginative and we like to ask ourselves what if as a way of entertaining ourselves. So
Mm.
looking around at the people around you and going, what if these people were bigger or what if these people were smaller isn't really that much of a stretch of the imagination for me. And I think that's something that across cultures, you know, somebody would be sitting around the fire going like, oh, you know, what if there was a gigantic version of Bill roaming the countryside out there,
Right.
because a lot of cultures have, myths of giants and things too.
Giants is another good topic. Right. So I guess if we can have
That'd be fun. I should do a giant book.
write a Giants book, come on back on the podcast.
Oh my God. I feel like giants, like we don't get enough good giant fiction these days.
I think that we don't. Yeah, there's a big gap there. And that was another thing they thought were real. And there's myths in the US, like the upper Midwest, it's like even like around Ohio that they found bones of giants. So it's possible. So, but what's funny is people have long believed this. And I'm not just talking about, some backwater Irish village in the 1200s, talking about Sir Arthur Conan Doyle of Sherlock Holmes fame literally believed in fairies. Now, fairies,
Yeah.
the purists are going to say, well, you're talking about a wholly different thing. Fairies are not elves, whatever. They're the same thing. So they believed in that stuff and there were all sorts of sleuthing and like, look, there was this famous photograph that came out that any of us can look at it now or like, give me a break. But back then it's like,
I'm like, this is the dude who wrote Sherlock Holmes. And he like looks at this photograph. He's like, yeah, that's totally fairies. Okay, bro.
It's real. Well, he was also on a lot of coke, so
he was also very Fox. I think he was probably just very Fox Mulder. Like, I want to believe, which is great. Like, all this stuff is really cool. Like,
but
like
is it real? Yeah. Yes.
I wish it was real. My gut instinct is no, but it would be cool if it was.
Yeah, that's kind of how I am about most stuff.
Wrong.
Like Bigfoot, I'm like, all right, if I had to bet on it, Bigfoot's not real. But am I leaving a little space open for the possibility of Bigfoot? Yeah. Anyone who says there's no Bigfoot, I know for a fact, guaranteed. Well, how do you know? Probably.
Right. Well, I look at it more like, if someone believes in Bigfoot, it's on them to prove their assertion, right? You can't prove a negative, right? But I agree. I don't believe that Bigfoot exists, but I wish he did. And if someone has evidence that Bigfoot is real, like please, like I would love it if tomorrow some guy drove into like a small town in Washington with like a dead Bigfoot in his pickup truck. Like that would be great. That would be the coolest thing ever.
That would finally prove the situation. Well, yeah, that's the thing. I mean, it could be that
prove me wrong, people. Prove me wrong.
Well, they could be extinct. So that could be the thing with elves. Maybe there were elves and now they're just extinct and it's too late for that. But that's the thing. I mean, it's this supernatural thing. So even let's just assume that we believe the things that people believed back then. So they're both supernatural and corporeal beings. Like they're physical and they're not ghosts. Right. They're not phantasms, even though they always had, again, fairies, elves, there could be some difference there, but they had the ability to waylay people to do all sorts of charms and glamour and whatnot. So that's magic.
Right. So yeah, there are a couple like things that you would have to believe to get to that. Basically, you'd have to believe in the existence of these tiny creatures, and then you'd also have to believe that they can do magical things, and so then you have to believe in magic. So
which most people did back then. I mean,
Right.
witches, magic, whatever. That was nothing new. But the interesting thing, I think, is that, well, so we think of elves a lot of times these days, maybe not in your book, but as friendly. They're friendly. Oh, look, Keebler elves, right? That's the most popular version. They're slinging cookies in a tree. But dark elves, which is what's more interesting to me, pretty much
Yeah.
if you go back, most of those fairy tales and the Celtic stuff, they were not friendly elves. These were
Right.
mean fuckers.
Yeah.
And so that's
Yeah.
kind of that's the different thing. That's the thing that it's been glossed over in history. That's what changelings were. So the elves or the fairies, they
Right.
stole your baby, they put one of their own in its place. That's a pretty
Yes.
hardcore thing to do.
Yeah. Yeah. Exactly. Yeah. And that's terrifying, obviously. And that's a very interesting fear, right? Because, like, how do you know the baby's yours? It gets at a very visceral thing.
Yeah.
They don't have a barcode on them.
Yeah. And then some of the explanation people have is that some infants that developed certain maybe developmental disabilities or stuff like that, they would say that this was an elf. That's what they actually would say about babies.
Right. And not understanding genetics and heritability of traits and things like that. Like, I get it. Like, you want to come up with some explanation for that's what all these things are, is like people just trying to explain the world around them.
Yeah.
Like,
Yeah.
what's that sound? Oh, that's Zeus, like, having a hissy fit.
Exactly. Yeah. I mean, we got to explain it with something. And if you don't have the science to do it, you got to come up with an explanation, or they're real. Again, I'm leaving that open. But yeah, I think I stopped believing when I was reading these books about elves, and one of them was talking about elves in Central Park. And I was like, there's no way there's elves in Central Park. This has got to be all bullshit. So that somehow
Yeah.
offended me. I don't know why.
That sounds a bit like Victor Laval's The Changeling. Have you read that?
No, but I am familiar with that. And the film, I think, was actually based on something that took place here in Colorado, in Denver.
Oh, the film The Changeling.
Correct.
Yeah. Okay.
Is
Cool.
that
Yeah.
is that a lot different than the book? I haven't.
Yeah. So Victor Laval wrote a book called The Changeling,
Mhm.
that is explicitly supernatural.
Okay.
So it's not about like the Angelina Jolie film.
Well, there was one before that. There was like a
Yeah.
70s film, The Changeling. But
That was with George C. Scott, I think,
right,
too.
there's like three
No,
different
so
things.
I'm talking about a novel that's completely
Okay.
different than the films. Nothing to do with it.
Okay. Well, I'll have to check
But
that out. That's cool.
yeah, it's about kind of like old world mythology existing in New York and in
Oh,
modern New York.
well, that sounds
Yeah.
right up my alley. I'll have
Yeah,
to.
it's I think it's worth a read for you for sure.
The other thing that made me question this stuff and just was, it points out how silly things are. I believe it was a Brian Froud book with gnomes, and then they had like cave gnomes. Like, because I mean, you think about the Victorian elves and fairies, they're all dressed in Victorian garb. So therefore,
Yeah.
these things are mirroring human culture. So yeah, is there one in a leopard print carrying a club, which seems pretty stupid.
It's stupid but amazing, which
Yeah.
also makes me think of that famous like Nazi gnome book from the 80s.
Oh yeah.
From the I think it's just called The Little People, or
Yeah.
it's like, no, it's Nazi leprechauns. It's Nazi leprechauns. So
Cool.
in like Grady Hendrix's Paperbacks from Hell. But
Right. Yeah. I seem to recall that. Yeah. Yeah.
my
I never
favorite
read the
thing,
book, but yeah.
yeah. So the cover is these leprechauns, and they're in Nazi uniforms,
Right.
and they're at like this castle, and they have like whips, and they're cracking their whips, right? And the blurb at the top is from, I forget where it's from, some newspaper, and it's like richly layered horror. And it's just, the blurb is so hilariously inconsistent with this like idiotic picture of these fucking leprechauns in Nazi uniforms. I cannot stress that enough. But amazing.
Really, yeah, it sounds like a really deep storyline there, but it sounds awesome. I love it. I mean, I love
Yeah,
stuff
I haven't
like
read
that.
it, but I would love to at some point.
No, that sounds perfect.
Seems like a good old time.
So here, let's get into some controversial territory here. So can elves mate with human beings, would you think?
Ooh, that's it. Well, there's the size issue.
There is the size issue. Although, do you see Shaquille O'Neal's girlfriend? I mean, it's
Yeah,
pretty much
I guess.
similar.
Yeah, and you have Chihuahuas.
Great
But
Danes. That's happened.
yeah, Chihuahuas to Great Danes. Yeah, exactly. Yeah, I mean, it might be able to go one way and not the other way.
I see what you're saying.
Maybe like a male elf could impregnate a human female, but not vice versa.
Sure.
But I don't know if they're really compatible or not. In my world, there's no human elf fucking whatsoever.
That's very
Um,
smart. Yeah.
yeah, I just didn't want to go there. So, and it
No.
also just didn't come up at all.
It should never really come
I don't
up.
want to sound like a prude, but for some reason, the subject of fucking zombie elves never came up when I was
Well,
writing the book. I don't know.
There's room for a sequel, though. So
Yes, exactly.
but that's I guess the biology of being able to. But let's just say they could maybe they could be artificially inseminated. So then there'd be a hybrid because they're humanoid, right? They
Right.
are. They're not like
Yeah.
dog things or aliens.
Yeah, I mean, like in fantasy, there's always the half elf, right? So
Halfling, right. Halfling,
from
right,
like D&D and stuff like that.
So they've thought about it. Obviously,
Like in
D&D
D&D
guys.
they can breed, for sure. I'm trying to think back on if in Tolkien, in any of the his 8 billion telephone books that he wrote, were there any human elf relationships that yielded children?
They don't really talk much about Tolkien doesn't talk much about male-female relationships at all.
Yeah, he's not big on fucking to begin with.
He shied away from that. Yeah, I wonder if in that world that they can do that. Well, so I guess maybe a good way to conclude things here is if there was an elf, and I don't know, are you married or anything like that?
I have an amazing girlfriend, Catherine McGee, who writes great horror, and you should check her out.
Sounds great. But let's just say it was before you met Catherine and you stumbled on an elf that was of age and very willing. Would you consider it?
Yeah, I'm gonna plead the fifth here.
That's the right answer. That is the correct answer. Okay. Well, I had to ask. I mean, I think all my listeners are like, it's got to go in that direction at some point. So I need
inquiring minds want to know. I totally get it.
I have that journalistic mind, and what can I tell you?
Yeah, exactly.
Well, Brian, thanks so much for coming on the podcast.
Yeah, Josh, thanks for having me. This is great.
It's a fun topic, and say a little bit where people can find your work and where they can get in touch with you if they so desire.
Excellent. Thank you. Yeah. So my website is brianasmanbooks.com. I sell signed copies of all my books on there. So it's a great place to do some Christmas or other shopping. And then I'm also on Twitter and all social media as @TheBrianAsman. So you can find me. I mostly hang out on Twitter, but you can find me all over the place at that.
Excellent. Well, thank you so much, Brian.
All right. Thanks, Josh. You have a good one, man.
You too. Thanks for taking a trip with me through Josh's Worst Nightmare, where I, Josh Schlossberg, survey the dark landscape of biological horror fiction presented by Denver Horror Collective. If you don't want to miss any of the great and sometimes disturbing weekly episodes I've got planned for you, be sure to subscribe to Josh's Worst Nightmare on a variety of podcast platforms. You can also sign up for Josh's Worst Nightmare e-newsletter at joshsworstnightmare.com, where I share a whole squirming mess of bio-horror, including my infamous haiku horror reviews and my latest dark scribblings. Speaking of which, if you haven't already picked up a copy of my cosmic biological folk horror novella, Maline, from D&T Publishing, you can find a copy of the paperback, hardcover, or ebook at Amazon, Godless.com, or Josh'sWorstNightmare.com. Yours darkly, Josh Schlossberg.